Okay, callable bonds. Now, callable bonds are exactly like the bonds we've studied so far. The only thing different about them is they have an option on them, an extra option on them that allows the person who sold you the bond to buy it back from you whenever they want, right? So that's called a call option. They can call it away from you. And so we're going to talk about why they would want to do that and how that affects the prices. So we're going to look at that. So let's take a look at how these callable bonds work. And now to motivate it, I've got an example here. Glenn's Discount Liquor Bonds. So this company sold bonds to raise money. They have a coupon rate of 9% on them, and they mature sometime in the future. And you own one of these bonds, you can imagine. So the reason we have callable bonds is businesses issue these bonds and they're paying $90 coupon. You can imagine the case where the issuer sold this bond last year and maybe rates were 9%, so this bond would sell for $1,000. The coupon rate's 9%. If the interest rates were 9%, this bond would have a yield to maturity of 9%. It would sell for $1,000. Right? Now, by selling this bond, the company commits to making these coupon payments of $90 a year. So it's going to pay $90 a year until this bond matures. Okay? And then what happens with these companies is that as rates change over time, this bond becomes a problem if rates go down. So you can imagine that if rates go down, say for example rates went down to 7%, well then my competitors can issue bonds at this point and they only have to pay coupons of $70 to get the same $1,000. Because if rates are 7%, a bond with a coupon of 7% on it will sell for $1,000. But I'm stuck paying those $90 payments. So as rates go down, it makes these coupon payments seem onerous, all right? They seem very high. I'm having to pay these very high coupon rates relative to the rate of interest in the economy now. And I don't like that. It's having high borrowing costs is another way to think about it. And if my competitors were able to wait until and issue these bonds when rates were lower, it can put me at a disadvantage. So I don't want to do that. Really what I want to do is refinance this loan. I want to be able to borrow money at 7% now and not the 9%. Right? So one way I could refinance this loan is to try to cut a deal with my bondholders. Right? I could say to them, hey look, will you give me this bond back? Right? It was worth $1,000 a year ago when you bought it. But the one, I can change this to 7% now, and now a 7% coupon bond's worth $1,000, so I'd like to just swap it out with you. Right? They're both worth $1,000, or they were. You know, you paid me $1,000 for that bond last year. Here's another one worth $1,000. Let's just swap those out. Well, obviously, bondholders aren't going to go for that because they're going to say, no, that would give up $20 per bond for nothing, and I'm not going to do that. Right? And another thing companies would like to do is they'd like to say, well, look, let me buy all of these back for $1,000 because they can issue new bonds today at 7% and get $1,000 for each bond. So they'd like to just trade them out with you for $1,000. Well, obviously you're not going to do that either because when rates go down, the value of this bond goes up, so it's worth more than $1,000. All right? So, yeah, I've got here, and by the way, in the original version of the slides I had an and here, and this really should be an or. All right? I'd like to either be able to buy these bonds back for $1,000 or swap them out with you for 7% coupon bonds. All right? And I say, hey, okay, you guys want to go for that? I'll pay you $1,000 for this 9% bond, or I'll trade with you, you know, a 7% bond. It's worth $1,000 today. You know, that's what I'd like to do. But obviously, bondholders don't want to go for that. So businesses, you know, they didn't like getting stuck in this situation where they had these high coupon bonds when rates had fallen. All right. So I've got the example here of, you know, if you issued bonds and rates were 9%, then you put $90 coupon on them to get $1,000. And then 1 year later, rates fall to 7%, and you say, oh man, if only I had waited a year, I could have raised the same $1,000 and only had to commit to $70 coupon payments. Right? Now, what I'd like to do is get those bonds back, but obviously, I've got the question here, how much would the current bondholders need to get their bonds back? Well, that's the case of the present value of those payments, but remember, interest rates went down. So since interest rates went down, the value of that bond's going to go up. It's worth a lot more than $1,000 now. Right? So I can't, it's difficult to make this work. Right? Yeah, so you can see the frustration here. So that brought in the idea of the call option, right? What I'd do is I'd sell those bonds, I'd put a call option on them and say, listen, at any time I want to, I can call this bond back by paying you 105% of par. So in this case, that's $1,050. So that means, look, at any time that I decide, okay, the person who sold the bond has the option. And they can just say, all right, I want to call those bonds in. Here's $1,050. You give me that bond. Right? And yeah, usually what they'll do is sell other bonds that will have lower coupon rates on it because rates went down. So they can, in effect, borrow the money at lower rates and buy those bonds back from you. It allows them to refinance. You really are refinancing the loan that's represented by the bond. Right? Now, as you might imagine, bondholders don't like that, right? Because you will call that bond back, or if I'm the bondholder, that bond will be called from me when rates go down. And that means the value of that bond's gone up. So you'll call that back from me at exactly the time I don't want you to, when those higher payments from the bond are worth a lot, right? So what happens is that callable bonds are cheaper. Right? If you have the choice between a bond that's callable and not callable and everything else is the same, then you're going to pay more for the non-callable bond. Right? So bondholders don't like this. So what they do is they'll if bonds have a call option on it, then they'll pay less for the bond. Right? It's something though that issuers are willing to live with. So most bonds in the past, most bonds have been callable. Most bonds issued by corporations have been callable. So corporations have said, in effect, we're willing to take less money for the bonds to have the option to do this because we hate it so much when we're stuck paying those high coupons and rates are falling. Okay? Now, actually, in recent history, in the last decade or so, interest rates have been very low, and they have stayed very low for a long time. So at really low rates, it doesn't make any sense to put a call option on these bonds. So bonds recently, less of them have had call options on them. Only the very risky bonds that still have a high yield have included call options. But at any rate, this is the idea behind the callable bonds. All right. So I've got an example here. I've got two bonds, and they're identical in every way, except one is callable at 103% of par. And remember, that means I can buy it, by I mean the issuer, the person who sold the bond, can call it back in, can buy it back for $1,030. All right? Okay, now I've got the goddess here, so what I'm trying to impress upon you is, if you were going to buy one of these callable bonds, one of the things you would look at is say, well, what's the chance that thing's going to be called? And it would be called if rates go down. So you're basically trying to say, how likely is it that rates will fall enough for them to call that bond in? Okay, and in this example here, I'm saying you're really sure that rates will be 11% or greater for the next 10 years. So you can think of it as the goddess told you, look, rates aren't going to fall. Over the next 10 years, the rates are staying 11%, they're not going anywhere. Right, well, if you feel pretty certain that rates aren't going to drop, then you don't think that bond's going to be called. They wouldn't call it in unless the rates fall. Okay? So in this case, if you were certain this bond would never be called, then you'd pay the same thing for both of these. They're exactly the same otherwise. Right? So, yeah, as I say here, yeah, in this case you'd pay the same thing. And then I've got the opposite example here that says, well, suppose you're really sure that rates will fall to 8% tomorrow. Well, I mean, if the goddess told you that, how much would you pay for each? Well, then you know that this bond will immediately be called from you for $1,030. So it's not worth any more than that. Right? Whereas this bond will not be called, so if you knew rates were going to be 8% tomorrow, you would just say, okay, N is 10, I is 8, the payment's 110, the future value is 1,000. It's just a normal bond. We can find the price of that, right? But if we knew this one was going to be called tomorrow, then we wouldn't pay any more than 1,030 for it, right? So I've got here, yes. This bond would sell for 1,030. That's what you're going to get for it tomorrow. So there's really no time value of money over one day. So that's what you'd get for that bond. And actually, I mean, technically, I shouldn't say that. There is a small time value of money over one day, but in this example, it's so small as to be negligible. So, yeah. Okay. So, but the non-callable bond would be worth that. Okay. All right, so what you're trying to do is estimate, hey, what's the likelihood that I think interest rates will fall in the future, and I can determine the price of the bond or how much I'd pay for the bonds from that. Okay, and then I've got another example here. Suppose you're really sure that rates will stay at 11%, but then at the end of the year they're going to fall to 8%. How much would you pay for the callable bond? Well, now what you say is, okay, this bond, rates are going to stay at 11% for the year, so I know I'm going to get that first coupon payment, 110. And then they'll fall to 8%, so at the end of the year, rates will fall, this bond will be called, and I'll get paid $1,030 for it. Right? But I keep the bond for a year, it's not called for a year, so they owe me that coupon payment. Right? So in this case, this would be the value of the bond. It's only 1 year because I know it's going to get called a year from now. It's 1,030, but I will also collect that first coupon payment, and that's $110. So that would be the value of the bond under these conditions, the callable bond. Okay? Okay, now here's the example of, suppose you're really sure that rates would be 12% for the next year and then fall to 9% at the end of the year. So this same kind of example. How much would you pay for the callable bond? So this bond is 10 years to maturity, a 12% coupon. It's callable at 106% of par, meaning if they call it, they pay you $1,060 for it. Okay? Now, if rates are going to fall to 9%, then you can be sure that they're going to call that. So I encourage you, stop and see if you can figure out what you would be willing to pay for this bond, given that rates are going to be 12% over the next year and then fall to 9% at the end of the year. How much would you pay for the bond? So I'll go ahead and solve that for you here. I encourage you to try this on your own. But what we're saying is that, okay, rates are going to stay where they are at 12 for the next year. So I'm going to put in 12 for I and 1 for N. And the reason N is 1 is I know at the end of the year they're going to fall to 9, and then they'll just call that bond from me. All right? And they're going to call it 106% of par, so that's $1,060 that I'm going to get paid for that bond. But because I keep it for a year, I'll also earn a coupon payment of $120. Okay, and I think I've got everything in there. I should be able to calculate that price. Yes, C, $1,053.57. Okay? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here. I'll pick up with the next slide in the next recording.